I feel sure there's no need for me to spend any time in introducing the charming lady who is going to conduct the seminar this morning. You're all familiar with her writings and publications and her reputation countrywide, worldwide, and her various travels in the interest of the causes for which she's fighting. And it's a tremendous satisfaction and pleasure for us at last to be able to present to the rally members Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly, who is going to conduct a double seminar this morning. Mrs. Schlafly.
Thank you very much, Colonel Bunker, and dear friends who got up bright and early to hear a serious speech about a serious subject. I appreciate the honor of being here and of joining with you this morning, along with our distinguished panel. Because I've had so many requests from those of you here to talk about the subject of defense, that's going to be the topic this morning. And since it is a subject of, you might say, of gloom and doom and a very serious import for our country, I have to find out, first of all, whether or not you're awake, and always we have to keep our sense of humor, even in the midst of serious subjects. So let me try out a little lighthearted thought on you this morning to find out whether you've had a good night's rest and are with us this morning. I understand that President Nixon had his annual physical the other day, and the doctor pronounced him sound as a dollar, but he's... I see you're awake. I hadn't even gotten to the punchline, but the doctor thinks he'll recover. I don't know why they always talk about runaway inflation that we have in our country. It always seems to come back. America was always known as the free enterprise system, but it seems like the way Big Brother doles out all the money in Washington, the less enterprise you have, the more you get for free. The automobile manufacturers have to conform to all sorts of new regulations to accommodate the environmentalists. Now the latest is that every automobile is going to be required to have automatic shift. It seems that when the bureaucrats run things, no one is to be permitted to shift for himself. Bob Hope visited the White House last week. I understand it's the only battle zone left for him to visit. He said that his golf game and Watergate have a lot in common, one bad lie after another. Down at the White House, they're so absorbed with this thing called Watergate that when they bump into each other in the White House halls, they no longer say, "Excuse me," they all say, "Pardon me." It isn't easy being a public figure these days. One week you're on the cover of Time, and the next week you're doing it. Watergate is a real situation of pros and cons. I just can't remember when we had so many pros who turned into cons. And they say the Watergate hearings are, of course, about lying, spying, cheating, and double dealing. And Brezhnev has gone back to Moscow thinking we staged it all just to make him feel at home. Well, now let's get down to business, since I see that you are awake this morning, and we do have a serious subject to discuss. I'm going to talk about the subject of defense this morning. I've given each of our panel members a blank sheet of paper on which you can jot down some of your thoughts, and hopefully they will come forward with the comments and questions that would be in your mind if you had the opportunity to ask questions about this subject, which really is very difficult and confusing to a great many people. Let me see if I can put it in perspective. Here in this wonderful country we call America, we have developed a system which is the marvel of the world. We have a system which has given more spiritual and material benefits to more people than any nation in all recorded history. We have more freedom of every kind, freedom of speech and religion and press, freedom to choose our line of work, to change jobs, to make money, to move to another community. And likewise, we have enjoyed more prosperity, better homes, better food, better hospitals, medical care, and more of the good things in life than more people in any other nation in history. This miracle that we call America, which we're celebrating the birthday of today on the 4th of July, is a fantastic political and economic achievement. Now, I wish that the other nations of the world would copy our formula for success so that they too could enjoy all the benefits that you and I have known. I wish that we could engage in peaceful trade with other countries for mutual benefit and profit to ourselves and others. Unfortunately, we have to deal with the world as it is and not as we wish it were. In the ancient world, there was a prosperous country, nation, on the Mediterranean called Carthage. It was a rich nation in those days. It engaged in commerce and trade of all kinds. It was really interested only in trade and culture. Carthage ignored the military threat from the Roman Empire, and they ignored the fact that the Roman senator Cato ended every speech with the words, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. And so Carthage wanted to show its good faith. They disarmed themselves of military weapons. At Rome's demand, they moved the city back from the sea so it wouldn't be on the sea. And finally, they sent the sons of their finest families to Rome as hostages. And when Carthage was thoroughly disarmed, the Roman legions attacked, and they killed all the men, and they sold the women and children into slavery, and they burned their city and their great libraries, and a whole nation disappeared from the face of the earth. Now, the lesson of Carthage is it takes two sides to trade, but it only takes one side to make war. And military defense is the basic ingredient in any country's national survival, freedom, and commercial prosperity. From the birth of our country until the nuclear age, our homeland was protected primarily by the great Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. We like to think that it was because of our great heroic fighters, and they have an honored place in our history. But when you analyze it, really it was the great oceans that were the first line of our defense. They didn't cost us anything. This was why we didn't need to spend much money on defense all those years. We had the God-given protection of those two oceans. These oceans were the chief reason why most Americans could devote our energy and our talents to business, industry, education, culture, and every kind of productive pursuit. Now, in the age we live in, those oceans are no longer a protection from attack. Modern technology has invented these giant intercontinental ballistic missiles which can leap across the ocean in 30 minutes, raining fire and destruction on their targets. We have the Soviet submarines prowling our coasts, carrying nuclear missiles which can rain fantastic destruction on our cities with zero warning. In the nuclear missile age, which is the age we live in, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans have turned into unfriendly lakes instead of walls of protection. I hope you noticed the speech which was made a few weeks ago by the number 2 man in the Defense Department, Deputy Secretary of Defense William Clements. He spoke in Dallas, and it should have been front-page headlines across the country. I found a little tiny UPI dispatch on a back page, but it tells the story in a nutshell. I'll read you this UPI dispatch. Russian submarines are stationed off both United States coasts with atomic warheads targeted at every major city in this country, the number 2 man in the Pentagon reports. William P. Clements, Jr., new Deputy Secretary of Defense, said yesterday that Russia's atomic submarines were equal to and in some ways superior to American subs. Clements said the Russians were developing and soon would deploy submarine missiles with a 4,000-mile range, much greater than anything in the U.S. arsenal. The threat to our national security is real and growing. Let there be no doubt about this. Now, that's a very important statement. He kind of let the cat out of the bag. Nobody else in the government in many years has said what many of us have known, and which is the obvious truth, that the nuclear danger to our country from the Soviet missile force is of immediate, urgent threat to the lives and freedom of our people. He said that the Soviet subs are prowling our coasts, that they have targeted every major city, that they are equal to or superior to U.S. submarines, and that they're building bigger and better ones than ours. Now, from the beginning of the nuclear age until the present time, the United States enjoyed clear nuclear superiority, so that we were in no real danger. We developed the atom bomb, and we had more of everything connected with it. Our superiority was built on the weapons which were built or ordered under the Eisenhower administration. And this is something which is very important to keep in mind. I'll bet there are not very many in this room who are driving an automobile from the years of the Eisenhower administration. But every nuclear weapon which defends our country today was built or ordered under the Eisenhower administration. When President Eisenhower went into office, we know that nothing happened to change the State Department, that the same old people who had been there losing one country after another remained in the State Department. But it was a different story in the Defense Department. In the Defense Department, there were people who believed in defending the United States of America from attack. And the policy was expressed very well in one statement of Eisenhower, which is now engraved on the keel of the aircraft carrier which carries his name. This quotation is, "Until war is eliminated from international relations, unpreparedness for it is well nigh as criminal as war itself." And that is a very excellent statement. And it is criminal to be unprepared for war, since the first duty of government is national survival. Now, during those years, we ordered, developed, and built the three great parts of the defense of our country, namely the Minutemen missiles, which are these giant intercontinental ballistic missiles which can cross the oceans in 30 minutes, the Polaris submarines, which are nuclear submarines carrying nuclear missiles, and the B-52 bombers. And these are the same weapons which defend our country today. Since Eisenhower went out of office, no additional weapons have been ordered to cope with any national threat. Now, these weapons were the reason why, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when President Kennedy was in the White House, that we had the power to make the Soviets take their missiles off their launching pads. The myth has grown up that President Kennedy looked eyeball to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev quavered in his boots and backed down. This, of course, was not what happened at all. What happened was that in the last inch of time, when the government sent a U-2 flight over Cuba and established without the complete proof that the Soviet missiles were there, our giant strategic air command under General Thomas Power went on airborne alert. At that time, we had superiority over the Soviets in the range of 5-1 to 10-1, somewhere in that range. We had it on alert, and Khrushchev didn't know what we might do with it. And that is the only reason that he pulled his missiles off their launching pads, and nuclear war was averted. Since that time in 1962, the United States has not ordered any additional nuclear weapons, but the Soviet Union has been in a massive armaments program that is without parallel in all history. Nothing in the entire history of the world can compare to the money, the effort, the energy, the time, and the determination that the Soviets have put in to weapons since 1962. They have come from behind us, they have equaled us, and they have now surpassed us. In the intercontinental ballistic missiles, these giant monsters that can get across the ocean in 30 minutes, they now have 3 for every 2 we have. In the Polaris-type submarines, they now have 3 for every 2 that we have. In strategic bombers, they have a new strategic bomber called the Backfire, which they have test flown. And when I interviewed the world's greatest authority on aircraft in London last year, I said to him, how far ahead of the United States are the Soviets in strategic bombers? He said, at least 5 years. We, of course, are not building a new follow-on to the B-52. Our poor old B-52s, which have metal fatigue and have been used in the Vietnam War, are still the strategic bombers that we are relying on. The Soviets have gone in for space weapons. The Soviets have gone in for an anti-missile defense. We have none of these things. And even these figures do not begin to tell the story of what greater explosive power the Soviet weapons have than ours. They just have a fantastically greater explosive power than ours. Now, the weapons which the Soviets are building have no usefulness for any purpose except to destroy or blackmail the United States. They're not good for anything else. And they are spending more money on weapons than we are out of an economy which is only half as rich. And in the weapons that count, they're spending much more. In research and development, they are spending more. Now, we have been told since the McNamara days that the Soviets were only building these weapons to achieve parity, that they wanted to feel equal with us, and that once that they achieved parity or equality, they would stop building and we would have what was described as a nuclear balance of terror. Well, I suppose a lot of people believed that, but the trouble is it didn't happen that way. The Soviet Union achieved parity in 1967. That was the year when they came equal with us in nuclear striking power. And they kept right on building. They kept on building at an even faster rate than they did before. Now, during this same period of time, the United States has been in a weapons freeze. In the last 6 years, we have not built one single additional missile or submarine, or one single additional strategic bomber, or one single space weapon. We gave up building to show our good faith. And of course, did the Soviets reciprocate? Well, you know they didn't. They kept on building even faster. And you don't have to take my word for it. It is all formalized in the SALT Treaty, which was signed by our president last summer in Moscow. It is all spelled out in the SALT Treaty, whereby they are permitted to have 3 missiles and 3 submarines for every 2 the United States has, and there's no limit on what they can do in strategic bombers, space weapons, mobile missiles, or in explosive power. Now, you and I are now today living in a world which is entirely different from the world we have ever lived in before. That is, for the first time, we are living in a country which no longer has military superiority. And the question before us is, are we going to sit by and let the Soviets attain such massive, overwhelming superiority over us that they can treat us like they treated Czechoslovakia or Hungary or some of their captive nations? Most Americans would answer no to that question. Every poll that's ever been taken, Wall Street Journal or any other, all come up with the answer that the American people believe in nuclear and military superiority for the United States. But the trouble is the decision has been made behind closed doors to answer yes to that question. Yes, we are going to remain in a missile freeze. Yes, we are going to sit tight and do nothing and hope the Soviets don't use the power that we know they have. Now, one of the reasons why the American people don't realize this is happening is because it's really the great unmentioned subject in the national news media. When a few months ago, NBC did a documentary on nuclear defense, the New York Times did a television review of it, and the New York Times admitted in this review that the whole subject of the strategic defense of our country, quote, has been somewhat benignly neglected on television, close quote. Well, that's the understatement of the year. It is a subject which is seldom mentioned on television, and so the American people don't realize what is happening. Of course, the reason why we are in the position as against the Soviet Union today that we are is because of the policies of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, which he carried out for the 7 years that he was in office. These were the years when, in a facade of being such a great manager, businessman, and statistical expert, he set out with a very methodical program of scrapping the great superiority that we once enjoyed. He scrapped 3/4 of the multi-megaton missiles that we had when he came into office. He scrapped 3/4 of the strategic bombers that we had when he came into office. He diverted the money that should have gone into weapons into the TFX plane, which is one of the most colossal financial scandals in the history of our country. He refused to build any of the wonderful new weapons which had been developed by American genius, such as the Skybolt missile and the anti-ballistic missile system, other space weapons, and so forth. And the net result was that with each month that he was in office, the United States was weaker than the preceding month. Unfortunately, the McNamara policies have not been changed since he went out of office. Nothing has changed in regard to the missile freeze that he put us in and the policy of stand-patism or give-up-itis in the face of the growing Soviet nuclear threat. How do they put over this objective of dismantling the United States of the great strength that we had at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and really giving up in the face of the growing Soviet nuclear threat? Well, it was a very expert propaganda orchestration that put this policy over on the American people. And this is what I would like to examine with you in more detail this morning, because it's very important to identify the myths and the lies that have been put out in this subject so that we can know where we are. It's kind of a depressing subject, and I hope that you will bear with me and not be like some friends I have who become so depressed reading about the evils of smoking that they decide to give up reading. Now, don't give up reading about nuclear defense because it is a subject that concerns the lives and freedom of every one of us. So I'd like to discuss with you what I call the 7 deadly deceptions of disarmament. These are the ways that this has been put over on the American people. Now, the first lie is summed up in the one word, overkill. We are told, and it's widely believed by the American people, we don't need any more weapons because we already have overkill. And this is variously expressed as we already have enough weapons to kill every Russian person. And sometimes they'll say we have enough weapons to kill every Russian 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times over, so what do you need any more weapons for? Well, of course, this whole lie is predicated on the false assumption of the United States striking first in a sneak surprise attack. There's no way you can make a case for overkill unless you assume that we're going to strike first in a sneak attack on the Soviet Union. And I think that such an assumption is beyond the realms of rational discussion. I don't think any rational person could even consider that as an objective. Now, if you remove that possibility, then overkill is a complete lie. The peacetime inventory that we have of nuclear weapons is an irrelevant statistic. The only thing that's important is how many weapons have we got left after they hit us. And the answer to that question is we don't have enough to do any significant damage to the Soviet Union. Anyway, the important thing is not what we think we can do to the Soviet Union, but what they think we can do to the Soviet Union. And in the Soviets' own Civil Defense Handbook, which has been circulated in hundreds of thousands of copies, they estimate that we can only kill 6% of the Russian people on a retaliatory strike. Now, 6% is not overkill in any language. And everybody concedes that if the Soviets would strike us, they can kill at least 60% of the American people. In addition to that fact is the fact that the Soviets are capable of killing our weapons, of knocking out our weapons, but we have no capability of knocking out their weapons. The weapons that we have, the missiles that we have, are only capable of killing people. They cannot knock out Soviet weapons. But the Soviet SS-9 force is designed specifically for the purpose of knocking out our Minuteman missile force. Therefore, there's no way we could fire back and just kill X number of Russian people, knowing that they're still sitting there with all their weapons that can destroy us. When I did a series of television interviews with the top authorities in this field last year, I asked Dr. Edward Teller, who's probably the greatest mind on this subject, what would be the result if the Soviets launched a nuclear attack on our country? And I think his answer was very important. This is what he said. The question is when. Right now, they could do terrible damage. In a few years, if present trends continue, it is practically certain that it will be the end of the United States. The United States will not exist, not as a state, not as a power, not as an idea. I think that more than 50% of our people would be killed. I believe that the Soviets could so behave that there would be very few casualties in Russia because they have excellent defenses and we do not have forces enough left to retaliate. They have air defenses, missile defenses, and civil defenses. It is possible that in a few years we shall be at the mercy of the Soviet Union unless present trends change. And I think that's a very sobering reply. When he gave that in front of a television crew where I interviewed him in Little Rock, Arkansas, one of these crewmen was kind of mopping his brow and said, he really came on like gangbusters, didn't he? And yes, he did, because he gave it to us straight. The second lie of disarmament is this deception that is summed up in the word sufficiency. Sufficiency is a word which is a Henry Kissinger invention. This deception goes like this. It doesn't matter how many more missiles the Soviets have than we have, because we have sufficient to destroy 1/3 of the Soviet population and most of its industrial capacity. Now, there are many reasons why this is false, but the most obvious reason is that no American president could ever give the order to launch a retaliatory strike, because he would know that by so doing he is signing the death warrant for the American people in most of our major cities. If any American president ever said that was his program, he could never be elected. The president knows that the Soviets have such superiority that they can do this, they have the weapons to do it, and that our cities are completely defenseless against incoming Soviet missiles. If a president ordered a retaliatory strike, he would be approving the destruction of every major American city. Our cities, which are naked and defenseless against enemy attack. This is why General Arthur Trudeau, when I interviewed him, said that the United States is the world's greatest nuclear nudist colony. We are completely naked to missile attack. The third deception of disarmament is a more sophisticated one. They say that the Soviets, they say that the United States has more warheads than the Soviets have. Therefore, we don't need to worry about the fact that they have more weapons and more missiles. Now, this is a line which was very accurately described by the Blue Ribbon Defense Panel supplemental statement as the numbers game. And this great document of a couple of years ago said that it would be difficult to conceive of a better way to mislead the public than to simply add up numbers of warheads without any regard to their purpose or size or capability. The reason for this is that the explosive capability of the Soviet warheads is so fantastically greater than ours. Just take, for example, the newest Soviet warhead, which is their SS-9. It is 500 times the power of our newest warhead, which is the Poseidon Merv. And to compare them is like comparing apples and oranges. They're not the same thing at all. The fourth lie of disarmament is that the SALT agreements stop the spiraling arms race. And this was the great theme that we heard last year when the President went to Moscow and with such fanfare signed those agreements amid all the champagne drinking. Now, the whole story of the SALT negotiations and the SALT treaties is a long one, but I think you can kind of sum up the attitude of the American negotiators just like that commercial on television where the man says, you see the man sitting there, and he said, "I said to the waiter, bring me the stuffed peppers." And the waiter said, "I don't think you ought to take the stuffed peppers." And the man said, "I want the stuffed peppers, bring them in." And the waiter said, "You're making a big mistake." And the man said, "I know what I like, bring me the stuffed peppers." And then he said, "I made a big mistake." Now, our attitude toward the SALT negotiations was, we want a treaty on nuclear weapons. And a lot of people said, "You're making a big mistake." But we bought it, poison and jokers and all, with all of the indigestion that is beginning to set in. The SALT agreements do not freeze the building of nuclear weapons. They do not stop the spiraling arms race. They only stop the United States. They don't stop the Soviet Union. And the only thing that SALT stops the Soviet Union from doing is digging more holes. And they don't need to dig any more holes because they've already prepared themselves for this SALT treaty by digging 100 new holes that they're ready to put their new missiles in. But since we haven't had the foresight to dig any new holes, we can't build any more nuclear weapons. And then in the SALT agreements, there is specific authorization for the Soviets to go ahead with their submarine building program until they have 62, whereas we are limited to 44, and as a practical matter, to the 41, which we already have. The SALT agreements also give the Soviets the go-ahead on mobile missiles, which is one of their great fields, space weapons, reload capability, and many other aspects of nuclear weapons. As the Wall Street Journal pointed out, the SALT agreements give the Soviets the option to go on turning out submarines like sausages. So people were very much misled on what the SALT treaty would do. The fifth deception of disarmament was the theme of a recent network documentary on defense, and it goes like this. The only reason we spend money on defense is to please all those generals and admirals, and to give those generals and admirals more men to command and more ships to boss around, and to give the pilots the fun of flying off of carriers, and to give construction jobs to all the people who build these weapons. Well, now I think that's just about like saying that the principal reason we build hospitals is to give doctors the thrill of surgery and bossing nurses around, and to give employment to the people who build and work in hospitals. Now, everybody knows that the reason we build hospitals is to help sick and injured people. And I'm glad we have doctors who take pride and pleasure in their job, because then they'll do it well. And I'm glad we have people in the military who take pride and enjoyment in doing their job, because they'll do a good job for us. But the reason we spend money on defense is not to give the military its kicks, but to defend the United States of America. Now, America is big and rich, and we have to have the expensive weapons which are necessary to protect our country against any aggressor. If we don't, we're going to be at the mercy of an aggressor who will commit a surprise attack. The sixth deception of disarmament
is another one which was a major theme of a network documentary on defense. And this theme is that our weapons, our nuclear weapons are wasted if we never use them. Well, I think this is about like griping that you've been cheated because your house doesn't burn down and you don't get a chance to collect on your fire insurance. I'm glad to pay my fire insurance premiums every year and never collect. I know I'm protected if disaster strikes. And I'm even glad to pay higher premiums to take care of the increasing replacement value caused by inflation. And most people understand that the more expensive your house, the more premiums you're going to have to pay. We live in the wealthiest country in the world, a $1,000 billion economy. Today, we are only spending less than 8% of our gross national product on defense, and only a small fraction of that on the weapons that really count. The Soviets, meanwhile, are spending about 33% of their gross national product on defense. And the seventh lie of disarmament is the lie that we should rely for our security on treaties. Now, it would seem to me that by now everybody in the United States would know that the Soviets have broken every major treaty they ever signed except their treaty with Hitler. You don't even have to have a very long memory. You only need look back to 1968, when the Soviets planned a massive invasion of Czechoslovakia. 6 months before the invasion date, the Soviets signed a treaty of peace and friendship with the Czechs at Bratislava. And then, after they had thrown the Czechs off guard, the Soviets moved in with 650,000 troops and every piece of modern artillery and weapon. This is their plan of action. This is the whole history of Soviet moves by means of sneak surprise attack after having accomplished a period of goodwill by means of a treaty. It would be a mistake to rely on the SALT Treaty if it were a good treaty. But since it's a treaty which proclaims to all the world that we are a poor second to the Soviet Union in the weapons that really count, SALT is simply an invitation to aggression on the part of the Soviets. You should also know that in the SALT Treaty, the United States abandoned forever our right of self-defense. Now, I believe that every individual and every nation has or should have the inalienable right of self-defense. But in the SALT Treaty, we gave this away forever and said that we give up our right to defend our people and our cities against incoming missiles. And they say it's mutual because the Soviets did the same thing. Well, I think that is about like Tiffany's jewelry store signing a pact with the head of the jewel thief syndicate that neither side will have a burglar alarm system. Now, there's nothing mutual about that. That benefits, of course, only the side which indulges in burglary. Back in the 1930s, there was a British prime minister named Chamberlain who thought that he could rely on a policy of treaties with Hitler and weapons restraint at home. His policy was very popular because this made more money available for social welfare. But history records today that it was a tragic mistake for which the British and the French had to pay a terrible price. And the whole history is that disarmament in weakness invites aggression, and it is strength that means that a country can remain in freedom. Now, after we discussed some of these problems, people began to think, well, is it hopeless? The Soviets are already ahead of us, and is there anything we can do but just crawl under a shell and pray for the Judgment Day? No, in the first place, we have to have hope. Hope is a very necessary ingredient in our lives. You know, I think that hope is something that women particularly are good at retaining. This is why the women spend so much money on cosmetics. You know, it isn't that cosmetics guarantee us we're going to be beautiful, but they do give us everlasting hope. Now, our religion teaches us that hope is essential to our salvation. There are two sins against hope, the sin of presumption and the sin of despair. And the sin of presumption is the sin of saying, well, I'm going to leave it all up to God and He'll take care of me. And the sin of despair is the sin of saying, well, all is lost, there's nothing I can do. Now, the person with true faith has to tread that narrow line of hope and avoid the pitfalls of presumption and despair. All is certainly not lost. Now, in this time, it's very significant, I think, that in the same year when the Soviet nuclear superiority became so apparent and was engraven in the SALT documents last year, that we were given by a good God a wonderful weapon that we could use. And this weapon is the great productive American economy that gave us this wonderful agriculture and the food that we enjoy in our land. A great productive economy that was able in World War II to fight a two-front war and still win and supply all of our allies too, and was subsequently able to put a man on the moon, is certainly able to stay ahead of the Soviets if we want to and if we have the determination to. But American agriculture is the crowning achievement of the free enterprise system. We have produced more food than any other nation in the world. We're the only nation that never had a famine. Our big problem in agriculture every year has been surpluses. Agriculture in the Soviet system is an annual disaster. They've gone from poor to grossly inefficient to total disaster. They tried to blame it on the weather last year. Of course, the weather was a small factor. The main factor is that you can't collectivize agriculture and have it produce. One little statistic, I think, shows the great disparity between our two systems. The American farmer feeds himself and 58 other people on a high-protein diet. The Russian farmer feeds himself and 7 other people on a starchy diet. That is a measure of the difference between the two systems. And last year, the Soviets were utterly desperate for our food in order to feed their own people. They detailed some 30,000 students to go out into the fields and scrounge the earth for even the smallest potato. This year, they have issued an order from the Kremlin that every able-bodied person is subject to being commandeered and sent out into the fields to bring in the harvest. They are desperate to have enough food to feed their own people. Now, in the midst of their crisis last year, when we had a great opportunity, we had them over the barrel. We could have gotten anything in the world out of them. We could have gotten a good SALT treaty. We could have gotten some freedom for captive nations. We could have gotten any one of a dozen different things. We bailed them out of their problem with the great wheat deal last year, which I think will, when all the facts are known, be shown to be the greatest scandal in the history of government spending. There are many different aspects to this wheat deal of last year, but it was at terrible cost to the American taxpayer and to the American consumer and to the American public and to the whole free world. In the first place, we gave it to the Soviets at a cheap price, cheaper than Americans have to pay. They got most of the wheat at $1.63 a bushel, whereas Americans were paying $2.12, $2.40 for the wheat. Secondly, they got that cheap price by means of the export subsidy. Secondly, we gave them half of it on credit. They got $500 million of U.S. credit generously advanced by the American taxpayers through the Commodity Credit Corporation. And there were immense additional costs in so many ways. Congressman Ben Blackburn has just issued quite a good summary of this, which I am reprinting in my August Phyllis Schlafly report, which shows that the cost to the American consumer, taxpayer, and public, in terms of not only these things that I've named, but through the transportation costs, the dislocations, the bankruptcies, the unemployment, ran to the tune of $3 or $4 billion. Now, this is what they got. And this is what enabled the Soviets to get our food on credit and then to turn around and spend their money on the weapons, so that there would be no slowdown whatsoever in their weapons building program. We have given the Soviets the opportunity to do what Americans cannot do, namely buy food on credit. Now, you know that 98% of the food that's sold in this country to our people is sold on a cash and carry basis. And yet we are taxed to give the Russians the opportunity to buy our food on credit at a lower price than we have to pay, with the consequent rise in the prices that we see in our markets all the time. There are even some politicians who are trying to give the Soviet Union the opportunity to cash in on our PL 480 program, Public Law 480. Now, this is quite a grocery giveaway gimmick under which a foreign country can buy our food and pay for it. Well, first of all, they get it on a 40-year loan at 2% interest. And secondly, they can pay, if you call it pay, in their local currency, which they keep in their country, which never comes to this country, and which they can spend on their own projects. Now, this means that they could spend it on such worthy projects that they might like as improving discipline in the Communist Party, nuclear weapons to destroy us, or whatever. In effect, they would never have to pay for it at all. They haven't gotten Public Law 480 yet, but there are many people who want to give it to them in the name of trade with the Soviet Union. And of course, then you know the cost that resulted on our people because of the high prices. The soybean meal is the principal factor in the price of meat that we pay. And the reason why trading in soybeans had to be suspended in the Chicago Board of Trade a couple of weeks ago, and why the price of soybean meal has risen from $89 a ton a year ago to $500 today, is because of these shipments to the Soviet Union. The reason why the price of bread has gone up is because of these shipments to the Soviet Union. And the decision was made, and Carol Brunthaver has been saying in his speeches that this export policy is a decision which has been made, is in operation, and will not be changed. There are many other aspects to this food program which are important for us to consider. The Soviets are sending over their fishing trawlers to go up and down our coasts and steal our fish. Last year, they took 50% of the catch off the Atlantic coast, whereas American fishermen are limited to 25%. You see, the Soviets don't have to abide by the regulations that our fishing industry has to abide by. They overfish. They go up and down with this equipment which operates like a huge vacuum cleaner, scrounging the sea and the bottom of the sea to steal our fish and destroying the young fish. There are the costs in the transportation industry. You perhaps may have seen some of the pictures of the boxcars lined up at Houston and other points to load Soviet grain and supplies onto ships. The Soviets have time contracted most of the world's vessels which are capable of carrying grain, so that they will be taken care of first and everybody else comes after. This is the principal reason why Brezhnev came to the United States. He didn't come over to find out about Watergate. He came over, he's got an espionage system that's perfectly capable of advising him on that. He came over to make sure that there would be no slowdown in the continuing policy of getting American food on credit, so that he doesn't need to slow down his nuclear weapons program. And apparently he looked very happy when he left. I think he seems to feel that he's going to get it, and get it on the terms that he wants. They have this continuing line of credit to the tune of $500 million, which they're able to continue at all times. The other thing that Brezhnev wanted when he came over was most favored nation treaty benefits and access to American technology and industrial equipment, computers, and so forth. Just before he came over, he made this deal with Dr. Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum for a $5 billion deal to build a new fertilizer complex inside the Soviet Union. Now, it was very interesting when this announcement was made by Dr. Hammer in Moscow. The press reported that he refused to answer any questions about the details of the financing. The New York Times subsequently did an in-depth report on Occidental Petroleum, which showed that the company was very shaky, that it was unable to pay dividends last year, and where was the money coming from? Standard & Poor's did a report on Occidental in which they cautioned investors that this would add only very little, minimal, to the value of Occidental stock, and that Occidental should only be invested in by investors who are hardened risk takers able to live with the volatility of the company. Now, that's pretty strong language for a reporting service like Standard & Poor's. And yet this was launched with great fanfare. Occidental is going to build a $5 billion fertilizer plant inside the Soviet Union. Well, where was the money coming from? Well, a few weeks prior to Brezhnev's visit, a Soviet trade official by the name of Alkimov showed up in Washington and began making calls on top VIPs. He called on Secretary of Commerce, and he called on the head of the Export-Import Bank, and he let it be known that he was asking our government for just a simple letter saying that our government approved of the deal in order to save the Soviets from any future embarrassment. And he made his little rounds around Washington, and then just a few days before Brezhnev arrived, it must have been part of the deal, the Secretary of Commerce and Mr. Akimov signed identical letters saying that this was our policy to approve of such an investment in the Soviet Union. And then it came out where the money's coming from. Now, you guessed it, not one penny of Occidental Petroleum's money is going into that fertilizer plant. The Soviets are generously putting up 10% of the cost of the plant, and the rest of it is coming from American credit, of which the key part is a $180 million loan from the Export-Import Bank. Now, this, of course, means right out of your pockets, because the Export-Import Bank is financed directly from the American taxpayers. Now, this is the way we have been making it possible for the Soviets to pour 33% of their gross national product into weapons which have only one utility. Food is our great weapon, the weapon that we can use to get what we want. The least we could do is to make them pay in gold. If we're going to stabilize their food supply, they ought to stabilize our money supply by paying up in gold. The potential for peace and freedom in this tool of food is fantastic. We could get the Soviets to give freedom of religion to the people in the captive countries. We could get them to pull their troops out of Eastern Europe. There are all kinds of things we could make them do. And this is our opportunity unless it's all given away. And somehow we've got to zero in and make people realize that the high prices you pay when you go to your stores for the food that we need to eat are the direct result of the shipments to the Soviet Union. This is the relationship that we must drive home, and which we can. But ultimately, we've got to rebuild the military superiority of our country, and everybody I talk to on this subject comes back to the belief that this can only be done through an informed public opinion, a public opinion which will not fall for all of these lies and deceptions that we've discussed here today. We need your help in this, help in knowing what the stakes are, what the consequences are of second-rate power, and why we must support the rebuilding of the defense of our country in order to save our nation from the most dangerous enemy that we have ever faced. I know that there are many of you who have been carrying on this battle in behalf of our country for many, many years. And we need to develop the quality of perseverance. I'm sure that many of you get feelings of being weary and despondent and consider abandoning the fight and going back to pleasanter things. I conducted a National American History Essay Contest several years ago, and the subject was George Washington. And the winning essay was written by a little fifth-grade boy from Tennessee who ended his essay with the words, I admire George Washington because he never gave up. And that's the quality that pulls our country through in any emergency. There are other people who may have more intellect or more talent or more ability in different fields. But the quality that we need today is the quality of perseverance, to stay in the battle till we ultimately win. And this is why you're here, and this is the message that I hope you'll carry back to your community.